Welcome back, everyone. This is a great opportunity now to be able to get into the first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the Torah. And these are the first 5 regardless of whether you have the Jewish canon, the Catholic canon, or the Protestant canon. It's the same 5 in all of those. So what exactly are we talking about when we talk about the Torah? Well, one of the things that we're talking about is the term Torah, meaning instruction or law. This is a major term in Hebrew that directs the title and the meaning of what these books are all about. When we think about these 5 books, as my mom taught me when I was a kid, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are the major 5 books that you're supposed to keep in mind. It's not a bad idea to memorize the 5, but they all go into what we call the Mosaic Covenant. They are considered to be at one time the books of Moses, which we'll talk about in a bit, but they all basically reach around and address the Mosaic Covenant and lead up to and then follow from that covenant on Sinai that God makes with Moses as the mediator. As far as when these books were written, it is very possible that some of the earliest of them would have been around 1000 BCE, and then the last of them maybe around 500 or after. So we're looking at a 500-year span of texts like this. This would be like keeping a collection of texts going all the way back to Jamestown and having those texts along with what we have today and putting them all together. It is a long range of texts to have together in one particular group. When would it have come together? At least by 550 to 450, by the time the Judeans are returning from exile. It appears that that was when they had this text. These books were not necessarily written in this order, and they could have been different parts that were then tied together in the long run and then given these titles. So who wrote the Torah? There's a great question about this. For the most part, let me go back for a second. Before we answer that, one of the things that's worth noting is that at one time Moses was viewed as the author of the Torah, and these are sometimes referred to as the 5 books of Moses. The problems with that, as we'll see, is that it's very difficult for someone to write all his material, including questions about when he died, how he died, or to call himself the most humble person on the planet. And that brought up the issue of maybe there were different editors or different traditions. And as soon as you start bringing in the question of, was there an editor, you have to bring in, were there multiple traditions that were a part of this? And this question really started to develop in the late 1700s, early 1800s, amongst critical Protestant scholars who began to consider the different ways that God is referred to in the Torah and different ways humanity is referred to, and trying to find different sources, different ways that these texts possibly were tied, and finding commonalities between the different stories, and seeing if there were enough commonalities across the board that maybe they could see different strands that had been pulled together into one common text. And so, as we'll talk about later, Julius Wellhausen and others would point to 4 major traditions. And this would be the earliest being J at 1000, E, the Elohist tradition, which would come about after the division of the kingdom in 900, the Deuteronomist, which would be, if not written, certainly consolidated in the 620s during Josiah's reign, and then the priestly tradition, which would do a lot of its work in the exile and after. Now, what exactly is interested, or what exactly is going on in this whole thing? Well, basically, the idea in this process is that each of these traditions wrote their story about Israel's relationship with God and God's relationship with humanity within their own historical and cultural context. That's not a huge surprise. That's how people do theology. But when you are able to consider what the situation of the author was and the situation of their audience, that helps you to interpret that particular text. And so if you're able to identify the particular source tradition of each text, even if it's a different paragraph separate from the other things around it, that can be extremely useful in terms of saying, why is this relationship with God defined this way? Why is this covenant defined this way? Is it because of the author's particular situation? And within the Catholic liberal arts tradition of interpreting the Bible, and the Catholic tradition of interpreting the Bible itself, one of the major rules is, number one, you have to know the author, and you have to know the author's place and time in history in order to understand it. Actually, you have to know the genre, and then you have to know the author's place and time in history in order to interpret it. That's basically right down the lane from St. Augustine all the way down to Pope Pius XII in his Divino Afflante Spiritu, and still now with Dei Verbum in Vatican II. Those are the first two rules. So when we look at these traditions that the Protestants started in the late 1700s, they still really apply to the overall major trajectory of how Catholics interpret the Bible as well. So why do we need these traditions? Originally, this has been attributed to Moses, as I had mentioned before, and there are some problems with that. Number one, the end of Deuteronomy depicts Moses' death. Secondly, the book of Numbers calls Moses the most humble man ever, which is difficult for somebody to call themselves. So, taking all those things in consideration, people started to say, well, maybe there was a later editor that added those lines. But once you introduce one editor, you introduce the possibility for multiple traditions that could also be a part of that. So the questioning of this goes into play, and then you have Julius Wellhausen develop the documentary hypothesis. Now, there are lots of problems with this. There's no question. We'll get into some of those challenges as well. But it's also worth noting that within, and I think Bergsma and Petra do a great job talking about those problems. It's also worth noting that the Catholic Church, I don't want to say has never really had a problem with the theory, but they've certainly been willing to accept it. The New American Bible translations and the study guides within those accept JEDP as reality, and the IBC, the Pontifical Biblical Commission, in its interpretation of the Bible for the Church, the IBC, talks about JEDP as well. Now, to be fair, believing Moses is the author of the Torah or believing that JEDP were the authors of the Torah, that isn't what Catholicism is about. It's a helpful way of interpreting the text, but it does not define whether one is Catholic or not. It's worth noting some of the key background of the J tradition and to be able to see what makes it distinct, what makes it separate. Today, people question whether J tradition was actually completely distinct or if it's more muddled than that. That's fair, because there are problems in distinguishing this. But it is worth noting that there remains a significant tradent of biblical scholars that view J now. It'll be in the notes of the IBC and the NAB. But then also, there's still something there. Even if it isn't J itself or how people have argued J, there's still something to be seen here in what the authors point out. So this is a very old, rich tradition, and this tradition in particular seems to emphasize Southern heroes, and in particular Judah's supremacy. It will refer to God as the Lord. This is one of the ways that people would identify it. It would also become one of the weaker links later on after the Lord's name is revealed. The J tradition describes God as immanent, anthropomorphic. He gets angry. His nostrils flare when he's angry. He crafts Adam. There are images of God that make him seem or analogize him to human actions. Also, humanity is extremely flawed. You have humanity coming from the dust. It is conflicted, incomplete, it needs help. And then the style is wonderful. Whoever wrote this did a great job. It's folkloric, but it's also great writing. They keep you guessing. What's going to happen next? That anticipation, that concern is always there for the audience. And then another thing that this tradition tends to do is it flips cultural standards or makes women prominent characters in the narrative, something that was not often done at that time. There's also very little interest in where rituals are done or how they are done. The priestly tradition and one of the reasons why J and P are often contrasted with each other is because they tend to have different interests. Sometimes they complement each other because of that. This might be one of the last of the traditions, and very likely in Babylon after the temple had been destroyed. For this reason, it does have a ritual focus. It calls God Elohim consistently until the name is revealed in Exodus 3:16. God is transcendent and almighty. You don't have the anthropomorphic characteristics in the P tradition that you have in the J tradition. Humans are created in God's divine image and are innately able to be perfect. So in the J tradition, human beings are flawed. They're from the dirt. In the priestly tradition, human beings are tov. They are complete in and of themselves. The style of the priestly tradition is poetic, it's redundant, it's rigid and legalistic. It's very, very clear. And the other thing about the priestly tradition, it's very concerned with genealogies, holiness, cultural identity, and how the nation in particular has a relationship with God. Not just all people, but specifically Israel. These all make sense given the particular situation of the priestly tradition in exile. This tradition has a focus on Aaron and a major concern for liturgical laws and where worship happens. Now, you can take a look at the creation stories and feel free to pause and compare. Read the text in Genesis 2:4-28, and then compare that to what you see in Genesis 1:1-2:3. Consider God's name. Consider how God is portrayed. Ask yourself how humanity is portrayed, and what is the order of creation. And you're going to see that even if we don't call these J or P creation stories, we have different trajectories. We have different presentations of how God creates the world, what order God creates the world, and how the people act within that. Take a look at that. Feel free to pause it now, and then we'll welcome you back. So take a look at some of those significant differences. Think about those differences. Recognize that just because those differences exist, that doesn't mean that one is wrong or right. You have the reality. Is God immanent or is God transcendent? Well, the answer is yes. God has to be both. Are human beings created in God's image, or are they completely flawed and interdependent? Yes. There is no, you don't have to have one or the other. Those can overlap and be true at the same time. And what we see in J&P, as often happens, is in theology is a dialogue. And you have a statement and you have a complementary statement, because theology is all about articulating the divine, articulating the world as we know it, articulating this world where we understand God to engage us and meet with us. And because of that, we have to allow for statement, counterstatement, and the whole dialogue of theology to be able to develop, even within Scripture itself. One of the great examples of, one of the things that the Catechism in particular does is utilize these differences between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 as a reason why Catholics shouldn't utilize a literalist approach to Scripture. As a matter of fact, the Catholic Church is open to a number of different interpretations or methods of interpretation of Scripture. In terms of Lectio Divina, in terms of prayerful, in terms of contemplation, in terms of critical methods, historical, literary, all of them are considered useful and applicable by the Catholic Church, except for literalism. Literalism is the one that can and will get you into trouble. Mostly because that wasn't what these texts were intended to do. Certainly not Genesis 1 and 2. And that brings us to a close for now. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.